The story opens with Carol Shelby, a courageous and skilled race car driver, reflecting on his victory at the grueling 1959 24 Hours of Le Mans. Suddenly, a doctor interrupts him, warning that his heart condition makes it too dangerous for him to continue racing. Feeling defiant, Shelby pops a pill, jumps into his car, and tears down the road. At the same time, in a small garage, young Peter Miles is playing with his toy car while his father, Ken Miles, tries to help a disgruntled customer whose car is giving him trouble. Ken offers some advice, but the furious customer storms off, cursing at him. Just then, Molly, Ken's affectionate wife, walks in and playfully flirts with him, instantly brightening his mood. At the massive Ford factory, Vice President Henry Ford, too, addresses his workers, reminding them of the company's proud legacy and urging them to come up with ideas to safeguard their jobs. As his words sink in, the workers feel the weight of the moment. Later, Phil Remington knocks on the door of Shelby's camper van to wake him up. Back at the racetrack, Ken's car is disqualified because it fails to meet the regulations. Shelby overhears Ken arguing with a race official and notices Dieter Voss, a sponsor, observing Ken's outburst. Tension escalates when Ken hurls a wrench at Shelby in frustration, just as the big race begins. Shelby watches Ken compete, and soon an old rival, Sam Hanks, taunts Shelby about his past racing career. Against all odds, Ken wins the race, leaving Dieter impressed. That evening, Molly becomes anxious when she discovers that the IRS has locked up their garage, and Ken reassures her that he will sort it out. In a meeting, Lee Iacocca presents his vision for Ford to enter the racing world, but Henry remains doubtful. He's aware of Ferrari's unmatched reputation for winning, but if Ford can defeat Ferrari, it would secure their place in history. The next day, Ken contemplates quitting racing to save their garage, but Molly insists that he must keep pursuing his passion. Lee then heads to Enzo Ferrari's factory, aiming to propose a partnership, but Ferrari turns him down and ridicules Ford. Later, Henry receives the news that Fiat has bought Ferrari, and he orders Lee to assemble the best team to build a race car capable of winning. Lee approaches Shelby with the idea of creating a car to conquer the 24 Hours of Le Mans. Although Shelby hesitates, he mentions Ken's exceptional driving skills. That evening, Shelby lays out a daring plan to Ken. They need to build a race car in just 90 days. Ken initially laughs off the idea, but Shelby persuades him to at least attend the launch of a new Mustang. On the day of the launch, Ken and his son Peter arrive, eager to witness Shelby make a dramatic entrance, landing a jet during his speech. Overwhelmed by the spectacle, Ken leaves with Peter. Outside, Shelby is waiting for them and invites Ken to take a ride. Ken's interest is piqued, but he remains cautious, especially when Molly notices them at the airport. Shelby then unveils a powerful new race car, the Ford GT40 Mk1. Ken takes it for a drive and shares his thoughts on potential improvements. The next day, he and Molly take the car for another spin, with Molly urging Ken to be upfront about his feelings. Eventually, Ken admits that joining Shelby's team would be financially beneficial. Soon after, Ken begins training with Shelby, testing various parts of the GT40 and preparing for the race. However, Shelby starts having second thoughts about Ken's image as a racer and decides not to take him to Le Mans. Frustrated, Ken listens to the race on the radio, disheartened by the design flaws in the car. Molly finds him upset and offers her support. In a meeting with Henry Ford, Shelby assures him that despite the setbacks, their car is improving in speed. Shelby earns Henry's trust, and anticipation builds for the next race. One day, Shelby surprises Ken by telling him they're going to build the GT40 together once again. But in a heated moment, Ken punches Shelby, leading to a playful scuffle while Molly watches with amusement. Afterward, they all enjoy a soda together and dive back into the challenging task of constructing and refining the GT40, determined to take on Ferrari. As Ken continues honing his driving skills for the upcoming race, Shelby receives a sudden call from Lee. Lee warns Shelby that Bibb, who is soon to take over the racing team, wants to remove Ken. Lee advises Shelby to stay composed when Bibb visits the shop the next day. While Shelby is still on the phone, Ken unexpectedly loses control of his brakes, causing a huge explosion. Miraculously, Ken walks away from the wreck unharmed, to everyone's immense relief. Following the accident, Ken talks with Phil, instructing him to work on a new assembly for the car. Phil, however, has a different suggestion. He proposes replacing the entire braking system, including the rotors, on the GT40. Curious, Ken asks if individual parts can be swapped out, and Phil confirms they can. Later, Shelby informs Ken that Bibb is now in charge and urges him to trust in the plan as they prepare to take a high-risk approach. The following day, Bibb and Henry arrive at the workshop. Bibb asks Shelby for a private meeting in his office. Once inside, Bibb reveals that he has now been appointed as the overall executive director of the racing program. Shelby simply nods and walks out, locking Bibb inside the office. Despite Bibb's loud protests for help, everyone in the factory goes about their business, ignoring him and continuing with their plan. Meanwhile, Shelby distracts Henry by offering him a ride in the race car. He fires up the engine and drives at an exhilarating speed. After a few intense minutes, Shelby brings the car to a halt, and Henry, overwhelmed by the experience, begins to cry. He suddenly understands that driving a race car requires tremendous skill and precision, something not just anyone can do. Taking advantage of the moment, Shelby stresses that Ken is the only driver who can win the Le Mans race for Ford. As they are talking, Ken unexpectedly arrives. Later that evening, Shelby successfully strikes a deal with Henry, and Ken is officially given the go-ahead to participate in Ford's race team for the upcoming Le Mans competition. While Shelby and Phil observe Ken's practice runs on the track, Shelby instructs the marshals to be on alert. Ken notices his rival, Hanks, and flashes him a sly grin. Suddenly, Ken watches as Hanks crashes into another car, leading to a fiery explosion. Ken narrowly escapes being part of the wreck. He then returns to the pit stop to refuel and change tires, informing Shelby about Hanks, who managed to take out the Mustang during the race. After 23 grueling hours of racing at Daytona, the competition rages on. The commentator announces that Hanks is in the lead, with Ken not far behind. As Shelby watches closely, he notices Lee and other Ford executives celebrating the race team's success. In a moment of inspiration, Shelby scribbles 7,000 plus "Go like hell" on a signboard and rushes toward the track to show it to Ken. Fortunately, Ken spots the message and follows Shelby's advice. Meanwhile, Molly and Peter anxiously listen to the radio, hanging on to every update about Ken's race. As the race approaches its final moments, Ken carefully calculates his timing, then accelerates his car. He closes in on Hanks, shouts at him as he passes, shifts gears, and adheres to Shelby's RPM instructions written on the signboard. In a dramatic finish, Ken crosses the finish line first, clinching victory. In the Ford Motor Company boardroom, Henry receives a phone call confirming that Ford has won Daytona. That night, after the Shelby American team celebrates their hard-earned victory, Ken spends some quiet time with his family. Later, Ken checks on Peter, who is still awake, working on a drawing of a racetrack map. Ken sits down with Peter and shares some valuable racing tips. The next day, Ken arrives in France. While staying at the Saint-Pierre Hotel, he takes a walk around the racetrack. During his stroll, Ken hears a familiar voice and notices Shelby sitting on the pit stop counter, drink in hand. They share a brief but meaningful conversation beneath the night sky. The next day signals the start of the Le Mans race. Ken and Shelby learn that Ferrari will be fielding Scarfiotti and Bondini as their drivers. As the commentators direct the racers to line up, Ken fastens his helmet and takes his place at the starting line. Moments later, the race kicks off with a flying start. Ken sprints to his car, fires up the engine, and speeds off. However, he quickly loses focus due to an issue with his car door, which gives Bondini in the Ferrari the chance to seize the lead. After completing his first lap, Ken pulls into the pit stop, frustrated with the door that won't close properly. Phil grabs a mallet and manages to fix it, allowing Ken to get back into the race. As Shelby and the Ford team watch tensely, the commentator announces that Ken has set a new lap record, completing it in just 3 minutes. Pushing the car to its limits, Ken's aggressive driving begins to worry Ronnie, who voices his concerns to Shelby. However, Shelby decides to let Ken stick with his approach. On the second lap, Ken shatters another record. During a later pit stop, Ken and Shelby discuss the race when they overhear the commentator report that Ferrari car number 20 has been knocked out of the race due to an incident at turn 6. That evening, heavy rain starts to fall, but Ken courageously heads back onto the track, Undeterred by the difficult weather, he races on, expertly weaving past cars 50 and 58 at Arnage. Shelby, ever observant, times Ken's laps with his stopwatch. Soon after, the commentator reports that Ken and Bandini are locked in a fierce duel, battling both each other and the worsening conditions as they approach White House Corner. Meanwhile, Bibb instructs a marshal to display a placard showing Ken's RPM. Shelby notices Bibb's move but is too late to intervene. As Ken follows the placard's RPM directions, his brakes unexpectedly fail, allowing Bandini to take the lead. Ken quickly pulls into the pit stop to repair the brakes. While the marshals work on his car, Ferrari's team alerts the race official overseeing the pit stop. The official rules that replacing the brake system is against the regulations, which effectively disqualifies Ken's team. Shelby steps in to calm Ken and negotiates with the official. Shortly afterward, Ferrari's car arrives at the pit stop, and Ken watches closely as Scarfiotti takes over driving duties for Ferrari. Determined not to give up, Ken swiftly gets back into his car after seeing Scarfiotti in action. As dawn breaks, the race continues. Ken manages to overtake Bandini twice on the track, reclaiming the lead. Shelby asks for an update on Bandini and learns that Ferrari is out of the race, with all three Ford cars now in the lead, Ken at the forefront. When Henry arrives at the track, Bibb approaches him with a request. He asks if all three Fords can line up together for a historic photo finish. Henry agrees, and Bibb passes the message to Shelby. Enraged, Shelby demands that Bibb recognize Ken's personal accomplishment, but Bibb remains adamant, stating that this is what Henry wants. Reluctantly, Shelby conveys the decision to Ken, leaving the choice in his hands. As Ken continues to break his own records and nears victory, he makes the decision to slow down, allowing his teammates to catch up so they can cross the finish line together, creating an iconic moment for Ford at the 1966 Le Mans race. However, to Ken's dismay, Ferrari manipulates the final result, with the officials declaring McLaren as the winner instead of Ken. The bitter realization that "they robbed you, Ken" becomes the sentiment of the moment. The story concludes shortly after the Le Mans race. Everyone is gathered outside with Ken, who still has the thrill and passion for being behind the wheel. But tragically, during one of his drives, his brakes fail, and he loses control of his car, leading to his untimely death, an event witnessed by both his son and Shelby. Shelby is devastated by the loss and struggles to find another driver with the same level of talent and determination as Ken. Despite the tragedy, Shelby went on to become one of the most successful and celebrated sports car designers in history, while Ken was posthumously inducted into the Motorsports Hall of Fame. The Ford GT40, which was developed by Shelby and Ken, went on to win Le Mans in 1966, 1967, 1968, and 1969.